Good evening and welcome. AAUW is pleased to partner with Beaverdale Books to present tonight's presentation by author Mary Swander. The mission of AAUW is to advance equity for women and girls through research, education, and advocacy. Mary will be sharing her newest work, the Maverick MD, that tells the story of how Dr. Nick Gonzalez uses an alternative nutritional approach to fighting cancer. As he watched his father dying of pancreatic cancer, Gonzalez drew courage from his Christian faith, from his Mexican, Italian, American family, and from key loved ones, colleagues, and mentors. He spent years treating patients with the most serious conditions, from cancer to diabetes to lupus. Mary Swander is an award-winning writer of drama, poetry, and nonfiction with a national and international reputation. She has published books with major New York publishing houses as well as university presses. She has won grants and awards from such places as the National Endowment for the Arts, the Whiting Foundation, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. Please join me in a warm welcome for Mary Swander.
Thank you so much. So great to see Ann again. We grew up in the same little town. And I have a picture of my fourth birthday party, and she and I are there with very curly hair. I don't know where that came from, but and we're like licking the frosting, that they're spreading on the cake. So it's very cute. So happy to be here. And I'm gonna give you like a tour of what I did during COVID lockdown. And I decided that COVID was a horrible thing, but it did wonders for artists. It really, truly did. As I live in the middle of the old order Amish near Kelowna, and they don't have any newspapers, radio, TV, internet, or anything. And when COVID started, and there are a lot of old people, and when COVID started, I was like, I gotta go around and tell them what's going on. And so I was like Paul Revere, and I drove like from farm to farm trying to explain this. And so I got to one neighbor's farm, and Verna said, we're going to have to stay at home. I said, yes, you're going to have to, because the Amish move around a lot more than you would think. They're on the go all the time. And I said, yeah, you're going to have to stay at home. And she said, you're telling me the English are going to have to stay at home too? That's what they call everybody that's not Amish. I said, English are going to have to stay at home. She said, well, how are they going to do that? They don't have a jigsaw puzzle in the house. I said, well, that's a good point. Good point. So we had a lot of artists all over the world staying home and, doing their art. It was the most... I think it was like probably, it's going to be now, especially because now all these books are coming out and exhibits are happening and dances are going up, that all evolved out of that period. So the first thing I did was finish this book called, and publish this book called The Maverick MD. And this is about Nick Gonzalez, who was a super straight, summa cum laude, Ivy League, MD, medical doctor, from Cornell Medical School, Brown University, Reagan Republican type guy. I mean, just not the airy-fairy person you think of when you think of alternative medicine, especially with cancer. So I wrote his biography, which is it's a real feat. One of my good friends is James Smiley, and if you look at her books, you'll see that she gave herself a different assignment for every book. She has a chart. I am not like a chart person. She's a chart person, and she made up this chart when she was 25 years old or something. Yeah. And so she was going to write an epic, and it all plays out when you know what the chart's on the chart. A mystery, a family saga, all of these things. And I have no such chart, but I genres. I feel like really confined and just like, you know, you're a poet and you can only write poetry kind of thing. So this was my first biography, and I found it really one of the most interesting but challenging assignments I ever gave myself. So, Nicholas Gonzalez. I should read you a few sections and then talk about his work. 1972, Nicholas Gonzalez descended into the New York City underground subways. Doors open, doors shut. Darkness filled the tunnel, the car jostling along, his fellow travelers seated beside him, staring straight ahead. His own vision widened out beyond the subway car. Nick, at 25 years old, was on his way to work at Time Inc., a great job for a young journalist, steady, reliable employment that provided enough money for him to live a life he enjoyed in a city he loved, and still have enough time at night to work on his novel. His usually glistening blue eyes assumed the gray tint of the day. Of both Mexican and Italian heritage, a full shock of wavy dark brown hair framed his face. A pair of wire-rimmed aviator glasses perched on his nose. His movement matched his stature, quick, powerful, and tight with the musculature and alertness of a shortstop on a baseball team, the game and position he had played from childhood to adulthood. In reality, he was a journalist during the day, but an artist at night. His novel was his focus. He came from a family of famous musicians, artists who made beautiful and classical music, appreciated great composers, painters, dancers, and writers. He knew he was going to join those ranks. He was going to be a great writer. Writing was his art. He fit right into this creative family pattern. He had never told anyone in his family, though, about his first revelation, his first insight into his own talents. He had been around 14 years old, so young to experience this startling event. He was in his room in his family home in Queens, alone, about to fall off to sleep, when he sensed a presence beside him. An apparition, a spiritual being. That's the only explanation for it. An angel. The angel was at once comforting and terrifying. Nick had no idea what was happening. The angel sat there for several minutes with Nick, then said, "One day you will write a great book that will change the world." Nick, filled with a charged energy, a focus and feeling of clarity that would carry him through his whole life. He fell asleep in a profound state of comfort and inspiration. He had no idea at the time how this prediction would play out. His house was filled with classical music and great books, but this experience was so extraordinary that he couldn't tell his parents. They would think he was making it up, inventing the incident to get attention. On the subway, he recaptured the same sense of inspiration and determination. He was going to write a book that would change the world. He was going to write the great American novel. That's why he was so disappointed to be going to Time Inc. to meet with his boss. A rumor had spread around the office that his boss was going to assign him to the science beat. How was this happening? Why? The science beat was considered the booby prize of journalism. Here he was, a young, up-and-coming, well-credentialed journalist, a novelist, who was going to be forced to cover the dullest subject imaginable. What a grind. He didn't deserve this assignment. So he he met with his boss and tried to talk him out of this horrible assignment to be a science writer, and the boss would have none of it. He said, "No, I think you can do a great job." And Nick was like really, really upset and really angry. But at the same time, he lived a little apartment on the Upper West Side, and it was starting to, I mean, kind of imagine it like this. What this store looks like. It was beginning to just fill up with books. And he was writing this novel, and he had an advance from a big publishing house. But what he was reading was mostly science, but don't tell him that. And he was reading people like Sir Albert Howard, who was really the guy who was like the father of soil, who understood that healthy soil produced healthy plants and animals, and people and animals ate those things, and they became healthy. And it's, you know, it's not too hard, but it's something we still can't wrap our heads around. And then he got into the work of Weston Price. Now here is a very, very fascinating guy. A lot of these people that were thinking out of the box were dentists. And, yeah, I don't know why exactly, except, you know, like, think about when you're in the dental chair. I always feel like, man, I'm so vulnerable. They could just do anything with that pick or that, you know, that drill or anything. And they're, you know, they have real intimacy with you. And Weston Price noticed that his patients that were kids that were coming in, their teeth were all crooked. And their parents had totally good teeth. There's nothing wrong with them, had few cavities. And the grandparents had even better teeth. And so he went off on an expedition around the world testing out a hypothesis that if you were eating a natural diet of the foods that were around you, you stayed healthy, in good soil. And he identified places all over the world where this was still happening. And now we're now at like the outer urbities and, you know, isolated places that hadn't gotten the Western diet. And so Nick became fascinated by that. And then the boss started sending him to interview like Nobel Prize winning scientists, right? And he went off to Stanford and interviewed Linus Pauling, and you know, the guy that did many things, but he's probably most famous for pushing vitamin C. And Pauling said, "So where'd you go to medical school, son?" And Nick goes, "I didn't go to medical school." And he's like, "Well, what's your degree in then? Microbiology or what?" And he goes, "English literature." And Pauling's like, "This is the biggest waste of your time." and Nick was like, "I'm going to write the great American novel." So they had this whole fight. And Pauling goes, "No, you're not. You're going to go to medical school." And finally, Pauling kept it up and persuaded Gonzalez to go to medical school. And this was when his own father was dying of cancer, and so he was bound and determined he was going to find a cure for cancer. And he went to Sloan Kettering, you know, the biggest cancer hospital in the United States, and they saw how bright he was, and they were grooming him to be the director of Sloan Kettering, you know, when he matured. And so every big-time mentor in the medical oncology field kind of took him under their wing, you know, or helping him along. And then he, this was the weirdest. I've decided, I used to think when I was younger that life was all about metaphors, which metaphor does wonderful things in one's life and enriches them. But as I get older, I've decided that life is all about irony. Irony, yeah. And so Nick's this high-flying medical student with Linus Pauling's background. And this woman who was a literary agent called him one day and she said, "I get this guy in my office. I don't know if he's a total crackpot or if he's brilliant. And he says he can cure cancer." And Nick was like, "They'll go tell him to jump in the lake. That's ridiculous." He said, "What is he, a dentist? I suppose it's another crazy dentist." She said, "Yeah, he's a dentist." And she said, "I want you to come and evaluate him if he's like a really nuts or he's on to something. Nick, I don't have time for this nonsense." And so she kept at him. And he finally went to meet the crazy dentist. And Nick said after 20 minutes listening to this guy, I knew he was smarter than any of my professors would ever be. And he had pancreatic cancer. He had 4 adopted kids. His wife had left him. He was 42 years old. And and the doctors had told him, just get your affairs in order, and this is it. You've got maybe 6 weeks to 6 months to live. So he informed his mother of this, who had raised 3 boys as a single parent on a farm and kept the farm going. And so she arrived and started throwing all his ding-dongs and ho-hos and stuff out of his cabinet and pouring his liquor down the drain, doing everything. And he's like, Mom, what are you doing? She said, I raised 3 boys by myself, and I'm not going to raise 4 more kids by myself. We got 4 kids to deal with here. You're going to get better. And so she's a little Kelley is her name. She started cooking for him, for traditional Irish food. And between the 2 of them, and Kelley was actually, he had all sorts of degrees. He did have a degree in microbiology and was really bright. And between the 2 of them, they put together a program that ended up getting his pancreatic cancer is like, there's no cure for that. So this guy got it at 42 and he lived, I think he died at 87 years old. Wow. Yeah. And so Nick was like, the guy is on to something. And they spent a lot of time together. Nick got his degree and all that, did his residency, did all the traditional stuff. And then he came to New York with $50 in his pocket, and he hung out his shingle to get, patients to try this alternative program. And he was always, I used to call him my straight man in my head when I was writing this book, because he was always so super straight. People would come to him and say, I think I really need to do chemotherapy. And he'd say, if you think you need to do chemotherapy, then that's what you need to do. He would not try to talk anybody into doing his program. He thought chemotherapy was just fine, particularly for certain kinds of cancer. And he got a huge, he built up over the years just a huge following. So it was really hard to get into him. And he had this straight man thing where all he wanted to do was have a clinical trial of this, like to prove the method, just put it through the paces of what any other method would be, would go through and be scrutinized. And he finally got the funds. And you have to, clinical trials are crazy. Like, if it were a trial for another kind of chemo or radiation, that would have been paid for by the NIH. But since it was like something everybody considered kooky, he had to pay for it himself. And so he kept trying to find sponsors. He was trying to find help from different people, and he actually went to Tom Harkin at one point to try to get some help from his, the Center for Alternative Therapies that Harkin set up, and he wrote a letter for him. And he finally did get money, and here's what happened. He got contacted by the director of the Pasteur Institute in Paris, and then he brought him to Switzerland to lecture to. They got together like the top oncologists in Europe, and he gave a lecture to them, and and got a standing ovation. But listen to what happened. So he seemed to do better in Europe than here. Nick stood on the balcony of an elegant old hotel room overlooking Lake Geneva, Switzerland, again rehearsing his presentation, this time for Goosery and his colleagues at the Nestle Corporation headquarters. Fresh flowers filled his room. The lake, a tranquil aquamarine, seemed to open with opportunities stretching out before him, and the Alps, massive, imposing, and jagged, rising above the water in the distance, challenged him to take his research to new heights. The next morning at the Nestle headquarters, Nick was at it again with new enthusiasm, explaining his program, its history, its theory, all the advancement he made with the pancreatic enzymes, and a review of his presentation of the case studies he'd made at the National Cancer Institute. After his talk, the 20 gathered scientists were full of questions and curiosity, wanting even more information and detail. After an hour of discussion, Goosery called an end to the session and walked Nick back to his office. A message lay on Goosery's desk. Urgent. Dr. Gonzalez needs to call his office in the United States immediately. Nick excused himself and placed the call. We have an emergency, his assistant replied with a detectable quiver in her voice. The New York State Attorney General's office called this morning. The Department of Health has brought a series of charges against you, and they are trying to close your office. Nick tried to calm his assistant and tried to calm himself. He'd returned to Goosery's office as if nothing significant had happened, attempting to carry on light conversation as Goosery toured Nick throughout the facility. Goosery would never know the content of the phone call. So, his assistant said that they had basically raided his office and took a whole bunch of his patient's files, and then they were going to close him down, take his license away, which did not finally happen because they sent him to like a rehab center for renegade doctors. There's such a thing. Yeah, there's such a thing. There's such a thing for Catholic priests. When I lived in New Mexico, I lived not far from this thing, and I'm like, what is that? And they're like, oh, that's where they send the abusive priests trying to rehab them, but it doesn't work too well. And I was like, okay. So there's a similar place like that for nutty doctors. So he went to this place, and they put him through like a whole week of every kind of test in the world, and trying to figure out something. And they called him in, and they were like, well, your handwriting is really illegible. And, and he goes, okay, I'll type my notes then. And they said, that would be helpful. And they said, other than that, you're the brightest doctor we've ever seen anywhere, let alone in this facility. I don't know why you are here. And they just dismissed all the charges. And that was the end of that. But the medical establishment just kept it up and kept it up and kept it up. And then this was the scariest thing.
What year was that? When was that? Did you already say?
When did he go up to that facility? So that would be right before I started seeing him. They were trying to shut him down, and I knew he was in trouble. I was really, really sick, and the medical models, I would have done anything they told me if they had anything to do, and they just didn't know. They were just like, oh, no. And what they did with me, they just kept saying, well, you don't have cancer. I'm like, well, good! What do I have? And then, because there's just whole big holes in the medical model. Like, they don't know anything about autoimmune disease, and that's where I fell into that bag. And so, yeah, he was getting closed down, I think. That was right. I was looking at the dates and then looking in my records. And I went, that was the day before I walked in the door. So anyway, we're now he did get the money for the clinical trial. They sabotaged the trial every step of the way. He was on 60 Minutes. He was on 2020. He was on all the news magazines. And they made him look like a nut until he wouldn't answer any journalists'
Question.
He just wouldn't respond anymore, and they published a negative paper about the trial without him even knowing that it had been written. His name wasn't even on it, and one of the reviewers stopped that from going to the press, and then they went off and published it in another journal anyway. I mean, it was just incredible, and it was about pancreatic cancer. And so you know how they do, they put out a call for people who'd like to be in the trial. And this was run out of Columbia, and they wouldn't respond to the people that had pancreatic cancer. You know, you just don't have much time. And so he would do things like, I interviewed this woman, she was like, you know, a woman of very little means, and where's she from? I think she was from like Arkansas, something like that. So New York City, she came to New York City to be part of this trial, and she's just, it was so scary for her. She found a cab driver who just would, you know, became her personal cab driver, who took her around from all the places she needed to go. So anyway, Columbia rejected her, and I said, why'd they reject you? And she said, because I look too healthy. She said, that was my guess. And so then she ended up in Gonzalez's office, and he listened to this story, and he said, we'll see you for free, and you know, you start our program. So this was so out. Let's see. This was like in the late 90s. I think it was like maybe 99, around that era. And she's still alive. She calls me every once in a while. She had pancreatic cancer. She calls me every once. She's like, how's that book doing? And I'm like, good. How are you doing? I'm fine. So it's amazing. I mean, I've talked to so many old patients that did so well. Not everybody did well because of various things. A lot of people came too late. A lot of people just wouldn't do the program. Many things. But the ones that like just sat down and did it and didn't, you know, whine and complain, and also had a support system helped. And most of them did really well. There was a real estate developer in St. Louis, I'll never forget this guy, and he had liver cancer, which is not good either. And he had 4 or 5 kids. And he had like 4 or 5 kids in 18 buildings. I remember taking the note on this. And he said, I got a really bad prognosis. And I sat down one day and I sold all 18 buildings. And then his mother was like, not gonna die. And he was in his early 40s too. And she found Gonzalez, dragged him out to New York. He's still alive. And he got cleared up really fast, like in 6 months or something like that, because he just did every single thing that he was told. So here's the scariest part. This is October 2013. Late morning, Nick's office manager took a phone call. A woman's voice came on the line. I called to warn Dr. Gonzalez, she said. Who is calling, please? There are people who are going to poison Dr. Gonzalez. Oh. Wait, who is calling? I don't exactly know how it's going to be done. Where did you get this information? There was silence on the other end of the line. What is your name and where are you calling from? There are head guys at cancer research centers. They are planning a slow kill approach so that nobody will know he's being poisoned. Poison? Again, I don't know exactly how or when it will happen, but it could be through his water or food. Can you give me any more additional information? No, the woman said and hung up. The office manager headed down the hall with tears in her eyes. She stood before Nick and informed him of the threat. His eyes widened. Nick told her to write down everything she could about the call and see if she could trace the number. Nick would contact a lawyer. The call could be traced only to a fax machine. Nick's lawyer advised him that it was useless to call the police. They were too busy to track down every crank call in Manhattan. A death threat should be taken seriously, but the call was probably just a disgruntled patient or someone Nick had turned down for treatment. His lawyer was sure that this call was from a nut who might even believe she was helping Nick. Nick sent his office manager home early. At the end of his workday, Nick walked home on his usual path, putting the incident out of his mind. He never mentioned it again to anyone, including his wife. And then, that was a year later, right before this call, he had written a book, which I think is probably the book the angel was talking about, called What Went Wrong. And he just laid out everything that went wrong in the clinical trial, everything. And then, boom, that call. And then a year later, his wife, not knowing about this call or anything else, heard a big crash in the bathroom, and he was lying on the floor dead. And they've never been able to figure out what happened. They did 2 different autopsies, a million gazillion different tests, and it's remained a mystery ever since. So read the book and you'll get all the details, and yeah, it's a little chill up your spine in terms of I would be completely interested in the story, even had nothing to do with medical things or cancer or any of it, because and I knew him as my doctor, but I didn't know him as a human being who had stood up to some of the biggest stress of anybody I'd ever known. And so that's what drew me into his character. I mean, how did he have such integrity to go through this process and keep going and keep doing his work? So to me, it was an example of one of those people that classically has the courage of their convictions. I actually took a theology course in undergraduate school. I thought it was going to be like a jump course, it was like everybody said, oh, it's an easy course. Father McHugh, I never forget the guy. And it turned out to be the most interesting, fascinating. He talked about saints, he talked about political figures, he talked about politicians through history that had confronted things like this. They had an idea and they were going to run with it, or they were a whistleblower and they were going to stand up to the forces that be with it. And I just kept thinking about that course, and then it's like, how do you get yourself through that? And for some people it's a spiritual, most everybody that I think in that class, that I read in that class, it was some kind of spiritual foundation or faith journey. But it also had to do with family, community, support, all those things that we know about. So that's why I admire the man, not only for that, but not only for the program, but the way he held up to that. Okay, a couple of other little things I want to do. What I did on my COVID retreat. I had a really strange COVID experience. I went to get my vaccination. My doctor goes, I can give you this. And I'm like, what do you mean? And the COVID trials, one of the side effects they were seeing was transverse myelitis, which is the same thing as polio but a different virus. And I had transverse myelitis. And so it threw you out of the forever getting the vaccine. So my doctor's like, no, you had transverse myelitis. She's like, no. She had written me a letter, and it was basically, get your butt in here. And I thought, oh, what she want to talk to me about? And then she said, I have to make sure you didn't get that vaccine. Everybody else, I'm trying to get them to get the vaccine. You, I don't want that. And I'm like, oh, okay, what do I do then? more isolation. And so I was actually, and I live alone, so I was actually on my little pandemic writing retreat for 3 straight years. Yeah. so I was like, okay, you can freak out, or you can realize that this is what you always wanted, which was a long stretch of time to do your writing. Here it is. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. So I finished this book, just the number of like resources, bibliography with this, it's just, it was like mind-boggling to just put that all together. And then I got a call from an agricultural group, and they said, oh, we'd like to hire you to write a play about the white settler land grab from the Native Americans. And I'm like, that is fascinating. So I threw myself into this and came up with a play that's called Squatters on Red Earth. And I knew I needed, I met with some friends at the Meskwaki settlement, and they were like, no, we don't want a trauma-rama. I said, no, I just I need to find a hook into this, a story that'll ground us. And so they told me that they had a very good relationship with the Amana colonies. And I'm like, oh, that's the coolest thing. And then I started doing research on that, and Mary Bennett, you must know Mary Bennett, yeah, from the Historical Society, she sent me all this incredible stuff and these photos with the Meskwaki and the Amana colonists having like picnics on the Iowa River together. It was just amazing. Yeah, Bill, did you have something to add?
Is Mary Bennett still working at the State Historical Society?
She's retired, but
That's
I
what
don't
I
think
thought.
she'll ever retire.
Okay, so
No.
she still comes in and out.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
And she's
well, that's
doing her
wonderful.
research. Yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah, she's an amazing person.
She truly is. So that was the core story, and then the white settler stories were swirling around, and basically the white settlers came for what we learned in school. They came because they were fleeing religious persecution, which a lot of them were. The Amana colonies were, but then they also came to exploit and take back slaves and all sorts of horrible things. Yeah.
Again, to follow up on your comment, because I think maybe there might be a couple people that would be interested. I had an opportunity to work with an amazing artist, Hildy DeBruin, lives in Cumming, Iowa, where the Pope came to Iowa.
Right.
They just have a documentary on Iowa public television that is going to be repeated later this month. But anyway,
that was just on.
it was just on,
Yeah.
yes, and I got to see it. But a lot of people that I think might be interested can still see it
Right.
at a later time and date.
You can get on the website and pull it up too.
Right.
if you wanna do
Okay.
that.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's even easier, better.
Yeah. So
But
what
anyway, getting back to Hildy.
Yeah.
She is an amazing sculpture artist. She has things. Well, the closest one to here is in the city of Johnston, close to Iowa Public Television Studios. Down Merle Hay Road and take a left. So if any of you have an interest in looking at a beautiful art sculpture,
That's it.
that's the best one I've seen.
That is really great. Okay.
Now, if I can add one little more footnote, because
Yep.
a few people might be interested in looking at this in their spare time. And it's only 5 miles away from here. Principal Park, where the I-Cubs play.
Yep.
If you park in the far northern parking lot, and and all you have to do is drive around. You don't have to get out of your car. Look to the right is a historic replica of a historic cabin that housed dragoon soldiers that came into Iowa supposedly to peacefully escort the Native Americans out.
Right.
But well, that's how the Meskwaki settlement got started. They were able to sneak back.
Yeah, well, they bought their own land back.
Right. They bought their own land back that they lived on.
Yep.
But anyway, and then I'll close my mouth, I promise. As you drive around that north parking lot, you see a 43-foot-long mural, 4 feet tall, made out of porcelain tile, and it never fades. The only problem we had, whoever put up the retaining wall leaked. It leaked. Water came in behind and punched out part of the mural. And I have a good relationship with Sam Barnaby, who used to own the I-Cubs. Michael Gartner,
Right.
I just wish Michael Gardner and Gary Gerlach, who I went to school with, could have purchased the Des Moines Register, but they can't outbid Gannett. But anyway, that wall mural, the city engineering department agreed to restore it best they could, because whoever built the early wall, the water leaked through, ruined the mural. But they restored it. It's just as good as new.
All right.
And then to conclude, all you have to do is drive through the parking lot. Look to the right. Here's the dragoon log cabin.
Cool. Okay, I'm gonna show you just a second. I want to get this in before we run out of time here.
Okay.
I'm going to show you this little short trailer of the play right off of my computer.
Okay.
So if you want to move up to see this, it's only like 30 seconds. So you can get in position here.
Let's see if we can get it.
Hi, I'm Mary Swander, and I'm the playwright and the producer of The Squatters on Red Earth.
Hello, my name is Rip Russell, and I am the actor in the piece Squatters on Red Earth.
So, Squatters on Red Earth is just one thread of that story of the history of agriculture and society, but there's a whole lot, a whole field of amazing stories that you can dig into.
The Cranky was inspired by the idea that I knew I was going to have to give an overview of about 100 years of history.
What brought me to this project? My good friend Mary Swander and I have known each other since the late 1980s. So we have a long-standing companionship as well as a business relationship. She's a terrific writer, and I love to work with her. So here we are with Squatters on the Red Earth.
So Rip, as the actor, is really busy. He's got to do his lines, he's got to do puppets, he has a lot of costume changes. Michelle Hines designed the costumes, which are really, really beautiful. He's got to get all the music cues to come together. That's a feat unto itself. We have sound cues, music cues, and we have some voiceovers by Native American actors.
I guess personally speaking, being involved with this play has been a great experience. Having a theater background, being able to use my craft in a play like this, which is so well written and so meaningful. I mean, as an actor, you can't get a better gig. So I'm just eternally grateful, and I think it's a wonderful production, and everybody should come see it.
If you're interested in watching this show, Squatters on Red Earth, go to my website, www.maryswander.com, and you can download it there.
All right. Now on video. Yeah.
It's now on video. Oh,
Yep, or bring us to Des Moines. We have not done it in Des Moines. So if somebody wants to bring us, that would be, make this.
I know who wants to bring you. Ollie, the senior citizen group
Oh.
at Drake University. There's only 2 chapters, Iowa State, Drake.
Oh, yeah. They talked to me about that.
Right.
That's great. That's
And
great.
it'll be shown at the Varsity Theater.
Cool.
Everybody
right.
can see it.
Get ready. Yeah, no, that would be great. Okay, I'm going to finish up with a little piece that I wrote for my Substack page. I now have a Substack page. It's called Mary Swander's Buggy Land. And I'm writing about 2 homesteads. One where I live in Kelowna, and the other I discovered my mother's family ancestral home in Ireland. So it goes back and forth between the 2 locations.
Where in Ireland?
Yeah, in Cladaduff, which is on the west coast.
Which county?
Galway.
Okay.
Can answer all your questions.
Yeah, I mean, it makes Manning look like a metropolis. Yeah. So this has a little bit of both of those homesteads in it. Today I bought my own tombstone. No, I'm not ill. I haven't felt better in years. But recently I updated my will, and my lawyer suggested that I get my end-of-life affairs in order. She referred me to a funeral home in town. Now, do you have a cemetery plot? The funeral director asked, going down a checklist he had me download. Well, sort of, I said. Long pause. How do you sort of have a cemetery plot? He said. I explained that my mother's family homesteaded in western Iowa. They experienced the first white settler death in the area, so they sectioned off a part of their farm, had a priest bless it, and from then on the strip of land became the Sacred Heart Catholic Cemetery. My great-aunt Julia, who died in her youth, occupied the first plot, her grave marked with a small, plain white stone with only her first name engraved on top. A larger white granite family headstone rose up out of the flat line, assuming center stage. The names and birth and death dates of my great-grandparents and Julia were engraved on the family stone. Then the markers of their 9 other children filled in the surrounding spaces. In childhood, I walked that land with my grandmother over and over again. We put flowers on our relative's grave on Memorial Day. We stopped, crossed ourselves, and knelt down in prayer at the family gravestones. My grandmother named each of the relatives. Here's my brother Bob, she said, confusing me. The stone read, Fred. He loved birds and knew all their calls, so we called Fred Bob White, then just Bob. And here's where I will eventually be. My grandmother indicated the plot next to my grandfather, who was the latest addition in the cemetery. And there's enough room here for anyone else who would like a plot. My mother was eventually buried next to her parents, and my brother found his final resting place a few paces down the line, closer to the railroad cut with its few remnants of original tallgrass prairie, the bright blue clear horizon stretching for miles above him. Well, I think I've got a plot between my mother and brother, I told the funeral director. But you don't know. When my mother died, I had gone to the priest to secure my mother's plot. He had pulled out a piece of paper, faded and yellowed, the corners eaten off by mice. The plots penciled in a scramble of unintelligible markings. Hard to know who's where, the priest muttered. We'll bury your mother next to her parents and hope for the best. The best did not happen. On the morning of my mother's funeral, the gravedigger called me just a couple of hours before the service. Did you have another sibling? He asked. No, just 2 brothers. Maybe somebody who died young? No, that would be my Aunt Julia. No, somebody more your age? Uh-oh, what's happened? Well, the gravedigger had hit another coffin in my mother's plot, an unmarked casket of a child. I didn't know what to say, but an ingenious and practical Midwestern decision was finally made to dig a bigger hole, placing the unknown child's coffin at my mother's feet. There's plenty of room for both of them, the gravedigger said. There are lots of pioneer cemeteries out there just like that, the funeral director finally said. If you want to be buried there, the best thing you can do is buy your own tombstone and stake your claim. I gave it some thought. Yes, I wanted to be buried in the Sacred Heart Cemetery with the rest of my family. I'd lived in eastern Iowa most of my adult life, in the middle of buggy land. I knew it would be much more convenient to just be buried somewhere close to my current home, but I didn't have a family history here, as I did with the Sacred Heart. And I'd once written a book of poetry called Driving the Body Back, about transporting my mother back home for burial. The long, dramatic poem had seen some success. It seemed only right to complete the tale with my own journey. Years ago, I'd had another idea. Many times in the past, I'd traveled to Ireland, searching and finally finding my mother's family farm and cemetery in Connemara. The Lynches were buried on Omey Island, a sacred site, a small western island, the only place in the whole country where the dead are taken out to sea for burial. St. Brendan's graveyard was ancient, hallowed, filled with Celtic crosses, and family plots of clans with deep roots and centuries of history with the place. You could stand on the Lynch plot and look out toward the strand, watching the waves part at high tide, and see the ruins of our tiny cottage near the shore, squatting there on rocky, untillable soil, the gulls flying over another treeless, open horizon. Here it is, I said to myself. Here I feel connected. I've found my real home. In the end, I'll have my ashes strewn across the rocks here at St. Brendan's. What a lovely ending to a good life. But that lovely ending ended one evening in Sweeney's pub. I'd walked there with my landlady's dog, Happy, trotting alongside me. The usual mist of rain suddenly turning into a downpour, the wind blowing up into a gale. In Sweeney's, I sat near the fire, a shivering, dripping mess. Two fishermen in slickers blew in through the door. They sat at the bar, water pooling under their stools. Did you get her done? The bartender asked. He's in, one of the fishermen said, tipping back his pint of Guinness. But no more Yanks, the other fisherman said. What can I do? The bartender said. The boxes of ashes just keep coming. In care of Sweeney's pub, the parcels say. Tell them we're all full up over here. Or at least no more elaborate instructions. What did this one want? The bartender said. I noticed there was a note in the box. This one wanted us to row out in the curragh, then circle the bay, dropping bits of ashes as we went, praying the rosary the whole time. Did you make it out there all right? The bartender asked. Well, we did, the fisherman said. And Hail Mary, full of grace, just as we were about to sprinkle the ashes in the ocean, the gale came up. Oh, sure it did. Forget sprinkling the yank, I said. Hold on to your oar, or you and I will both be bound for St. Brendan's. I pounded the lid back on the box. Holy Mary, Mother of God. I just fecked the ashes in one big lump, sinking to the bottom of the sea. After that, I rethought my burial plans. I began to realize that the concept of home is transitory. Maybe push others out of their homes. At any given time, we are suspended in space. We only know a fraction of our clan. We can have an emotional connection with those who have come before us, but we can't really go back. One way or another, most of us live in a state of displacement. So, I intend to have my stone installed in what I think is my plot in the Sacred Heart Cemetery in Carroll County, Iowa, and hope for the best. I've also left some simple instructions. At the graveside, please read the ending of Driving the Body Back. Then everybody can go and have a pint on me. And here's the ending of Driving the Body Back. And when Frankie asks about the cemetery plot, I see my mother going under. Hear the clouds break loose. The rain pelt down. You stand with me again under the canopy in your plastic bonnet, drawn tight under the chin. We watch the incense circle up into the sky, wait for the priests, the acolytes, all the other mourners to leave, and say one last prayer together. Then we tramp down the row, you bending to pull some weeds grown up around Jim's stone, vowing to do a rubbing of Julia's, her dates so dim. When we reach the end, where the land drops off into the railroad cut, mud sliding down, raspberries tangling up, our eyes measure the space, and you say, there's enough room, at least, for you and me. Thank you so much.